Everyone this evening in person, and those of you that are joining us on Zoom this evening. We're really excited to have you all here for this special evening. We have a lecture and a concert performance this evening on campus. So thanks so much for joining if you're here in person and if you're here online. My name's Mark Barnico. I'm the Executive Director of the UChicago campus here in Hong Kong, and I'm delighted to have all of you this evening. We started working on this exhibition, I would say probably a year and a half, maybe a little bit more, maybe 2 years ago. And our faculty director, Ken Pomeranz, Professor Ken Pomeranz, he really spearheaded this effort. And we're very fortunate, and I think one of the family members, the daughter of Professor Bard, is on her way down. But the son of Solomon Bard is here this evening. Paul Bard, maybe you want to wave and let everybody know who you are. Monica Bard came from the UK to be here tonight, and Paul Bard came here from Australia. Sydney, is that right? Sydney, Australia. So we're really excited to have you here to see the culmination of all this work that's been going on behind the scenes. And I think this is Monica Bard here walking in. So say hi, Monica. Come on down in front. Come on down in front. So yeah, we have many special guests here tonight. We're thrilled to have you. The exhibition is called Refugee and Renaissance Man, Solomon Bard, 1916 to 2014 in Hong Kong. And Solomon Bard was just such a special figure. You're going to hear much more about him tonight and learn more about his influence on Hong Kong from Professor Pomeranz. Ken Pomeranz he's really one of the most esteemed professors within the University of Chicago system. We call our top professors university professors, and Professor Pomeranz is world-renowned for his work on modern Chinese history. And so we're thrilled to have him also as this campus faculty director. So Ken is our collaborator here as we're working on various programs and projects, including the exhibition, which some of you will see after this lecture tonight, as well as this lecture and the program upstairs. I think that starts at 6:30, if I'm not mistaken, for the concert. So please stick around for the concert. I'm going to turn the stage over to Professor Pomeranz to give his talk on Solomon Bard. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you everybody for being here. We've used the term Renaissance Man in the title of our exhibit, of this evening's concert, and of this lecture. And not surprisingly, since they center on a man who was a doctor, a musician, an archaeologist, a civil servant, an author, and more. In the next hour, I want to suggest that the term is appropriate in another sense, too. Because Solomon Bard was not only a multi-talented individual, but he was also part of a post-war wave of cultural development in Hong Kong that was a kind of renaissance, and that should also be seen in the context of the multiple post-war cultural flowerings that accompanied decolonization in many other parts of the world, as nascent nations staked out cultural canons for themselves. So even though politically there was no decolonization in post-war Hong Kong, and only very modest gestures towards greater political inclusion, I think Bard's biography helps us understand a post-World War II cultural transformation that had some of the same characteristics that we find in other areas of the world that were decolonized. Bard lived such a rich and complicated life that any remotely adequate summary would more than use up my time, even though I'm just going to barely touch on his personal life. And I hope many of you have gotten most of the story, whether from our exhibit or elsewhere. But a quick sketch is probably necessary before we zoom out to a broader picture of his era. He was born in Chita, Siberia, a remote but reasonably prosperous railway town that you see here, in 1916. to a family of Polish-Russian Jews who ran a jewelry store there. The Russian Revolution broke out the following year, but it took a while to affect Chita. As Soviet rule became stricter in the mid-1920s, and most of the Bard family's property was confiscated, the Bards fled to Harbin, Manchuria, another bigger railroad town with a large Russian minority, including quite a few Russian Jews, that had its own schools, stores, etc. So there's the town, and here's a Harbin street scene. Much of this was still the same as late as the 1990s. Sali, as he became known among some people, though he was Manya to others, went to Russian schools and also studied the violin, thinking that he might someday play professionally. Now, Manchuria was then ruled by the Chinese warlord, Zhang Zuolin, but Soviet and especially Japanese forces hovered in the background, as did White Russian criminal gangs. In 1931 to 32, Japanese army units based in southern Manchuria launched a coup, creating a puppet state that very few other countries recognized. One consequence of that was that business in Harbin fell off sharply. While the Japanese, who for various reasons were more interested in southern than northern Manchuria, gave free rein in Harbin to White Russian gangs with whom they shared a die-hard anti-communism and interests in the drug trade. This was particularly threatening for Harbin's Jews, as those gangs were also violently anti-Semitic. There were Jewish youth groups, including one that Bard belonged to for a while, that sometimes provided protection against this, but they were increasingly overmatched as the White Russians became more closely tied to the Japanese-sponsored local government. Bard's parents fled to Buenos Aires, where his mother had relatives, while Sali, his brother Leo, and their uncle David opted for Shanghai's international settlement. Although Bard had considered a musical career, he and his family had decided by this time that he would instead work on his English in Shanghai and then apply to medical school in Hong Kong. A Hong Kong medical degree would allow him to practice anywhere in the British Empire. Remarkably, Bard graduated first in his class from HKU's med school in 1939, after along the way volunteering in the 1937 cholera epidemic and continuing to play violin, including a number of public concerts. He started interning at Queen Mary Hospital, which at the time was just a couple of years old. With war breaking out in Europe, he also joined the Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Corps as a medic, strongly encouraged to do so by the dean then of HKU's medical school. When the Japanese invaded Hong Kong in December 1941, the big gun on the top of Mount Davis was one of the defenders' most useful weapons, and the Japanese bombed it there are his mobilization papers. And the Japanese bombed Mount Davis quite heavily. Bard was in charge of a first aid and triage unit near the mountaintop. He also put in time a bit down the hill at a secondary treatment station at the Jubilee Battery, which is just a few yards from where we are now sitting. And he occasionally rested at the Felix Villas across the road. Twice during the 18 days of the war, he was almost hit by Japanese bombs. He was captured here when Hong Kong surrendered on December 25th. 44 months as a POW followed, which changed his life in both predictable and unpredictable ways. Bard's medical duties continued in camp. They were complicated by supply shortages and poor nutrition, creating a kind of practice that no medical school could prepare you for. He stuck to those duties, and he did not join any escape attempts. But he did serve as a lookout for one, using his violin playing as a signal. When the Japanese investigated that escape, he avoided severe punishment only thanks to a combination of luck and another prisoner's bravery. A man named Beard, whom the Japanese mistook for Bard when that name came up in interrogation, and who, despite being tortured, never told them whom they were actually looking for. A happier event, with long-term consequences, was Bard's formation of a prisoner's orchestra. He conducted, played violin, and arranged music to fit the rather unconventional mix of musicians and instruments available, including a cello made from an abandoned oil drum. We actually have our own cello made from an abandoned oil drum in the exhibit, though it's not quite the same as the original. Here's the concert program front. Another program. This is the inside of the concert program. After the war and some further medical education in the UK, Bard joined a Hong Kong medical practice. Somewhat later, HKU recruited him to start a student and staff health service, which he then headed from 1956 to 1976. And it's worth remembering how much worse general health conditions were in that poverty-stricken city than they are in the Hong Kong of today. So being head of a campus medical program was far from a cushy job. As late as 1958, 8% of HKU students, though they were healthier than the population in general, 8% of them had either active or quiescent tuberculosis. Think about that. He continued practicing medicine even beyond retiring from that position, still doing hospital rounds into the 1980s. But cultural activities were equally important to him. The amateur Sino-British Orchestra, which grew out of the former POW orchestra, was a particular priority. Bard not only played in it and often conducted it, but was a tireless recruiter of new musicians and eventually of its first professional conductor, Arrigo Foa. He was an energetic seeker of the support needed to professionalize it and a determined advocate for the new city hall that would eventually include a first-rate concert hall where it would play. The old city hall had been demolished in the 1930s. All these goals were achieved. The SBO became the Hong Kong Philharmonic in 1957, and the new City Hall, where it still plays, opened in 1962. It also served as the first homes of both the Hong Kong History Museum and the Hong Kong Art Museum, and it includes the city's official World War II memorial and hosts a number of civic events. And one musical interest led to another. Dr. David Wong, a flautist in the Sino-British Orchestra, also led a small, strictly recreational Chinese music ensemble. He invited Bard to join and taught him the dizi, the Chinese flute. Now, Chinese music was traditionally played by small improvisational groups, not by large institutionalized orchestras. This began to change in the 1920s as part of a May 4th era campaign to create Chinese parallels to modern Western practices. Other examples include the formalization and promotion of Peking opera as China's national form of musical theater, culminating in Mei Lanfang's tour of the United States in 1930, which was a huge event at the time, and the rise of Chinese spoken word drama, starting, interestingly enough, from a 1907 play based on Uncle Tom's Cabin, and culminating in the 30s with the recognition of Cao Yu as a major dramatist, often compared to Ibsen and O'Neill, whose works he had produced as a student in the 1920s at Nankai High School in Tianjin. A Chinese orchestra was formed in Shanghai, and was supposed to actually perform at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, for which it received backing from the nationalist government. But for reasons that are unclear, they never made it there. National orchestras for Chinese music were finally established in both the People's Republic and the Republic of China on Taiwan during the 1950s. China's Cultural Revolution, however, from 1966 to 76, sent this momentum into reverse. Only a few so-called revolutionary scores remained acceptable, and musicians playing anything else risked persecution. Many fled, often to Hong Kong. And Bard joined with other social and cultural leaders who saw both an obligation to protect Chinese culture and an opportunity for Hong Kong to promote itself as a global cultural center. They asked the Urban Council to fund a full-time professional Chinese orchestra, and its Department of Cultural Services, headed by Darwin Chun, who's with us here tonight, agreed. And the Hong Kong Chinese Orchestra was officially launched in 1977. From the beginning, Bard was the group's only non-Chinese participant. He was a frequent guest conductor, he created arrangements for the orchestra, and he consulted on organizational matters. But at the time, he had a full-time job heading the Antiquities and Monuments Office, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the orchestra also had a conductor and music director, Ng Tai Gong. In 1983, Bard's AMO job had ended, and he became the HKCO's assistant music director. The orchestra was divided into factions, often based on native place, and Ng clashed frequently with both its musicians and its institutional sponsors, making Bard's presumed neutrality, since he wasn't from any part of China, really, and his diplomatic and management skills invaluable. When Ng stepped down abruptly in 1984, Bard became the de facto music director, though he always declined the title. He thus conducted the orchestra through several landmark performances, including its groundbreaking trip in 1987 to Beijing, while helping to stabilize it institutionally and helping to hire a new regular music director in 1987. He returned frequently as a guest conductor over the next 20 years, while the HKCO grew into one of the world's premier Chinese music companies. Bard also remained involved with the Hong Kong Volunteers, who were reconstituted as the Hong Kong Defense Force, auxiliary to the Army, in 1949. He became its senior medical officer, not on regular duty, but rendering assistance when needed. In the 1960s, he became the sole officer of its 17-member medical unit, and notably improved its emergency readiness. When Hong Kong's 1967 riots showed how distant from the government many people felt, Bard's unit began monthly operations in which they would helicopter into a remote village and run a weekend-long pop-up clinic. One picture from that. There's another. He remained in the Volunteers until their dissolution in 1996, serving twice as honorary colonel and participating in border patrols, trainings, emergency aid operations, and so on. Finally, we come to Bard's work in archaeology and historic preservation. Hong Kong had no government organization and few rules in this area in 1945, though there were some notable amateur archaeologists and an HKU-affiliated archaeology group was launched in 1956. Meanwhile, rapid post-war development threatened a great many sites, and in fact, many of them disappeared before they were even documented. Hong Kong had about 600,000 people on VJ Day. It had 3 million by 1960, so that's an awful lot of construction. Bard was one of the people who proposed an Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance all the way back in 1957. But for a long time, such plans went nowhere. When an informal advisory board was established in 1972, Bard chaired it. And when a full-time paid organization was finally established in 1976, Bard became its first executive director. He had trained for this in part by going to Australia for a year, since no Hong Kong institution at the time had a real archaeology program. He began putting rules in place, recruiting a small professional staff, and cataloging sites meriting preservation and/or future excavation. This work, interestingly enough, was often controversial. Among other things, Bard was sometimes publicly criticized for not having done what some people felt should have been done to protect some admired colonial buildings from redevelopment. He argued, however, that the greatest need was for the preservation of Chinese sites, ranging from late Paleolithic ruins to fragile 19th century village temples in the new territories. Those priorities matched what a private poll that the AMO commissioned said most ordinary people cared about. They were also the sites that needed, or most needed, government intervention, since their owners, if any, often had little money. And they were also, unlike the downtown sites of the colonial buildings that often had the loudest advocates, mostly among Europeans, sites that could be protected without slowing down big and important new development. I could, of course, go on cataloging Bard's many other achievements, but I'm also drawn to thinking about what his remarkable individual career tells us about other collective issues. And I began that inquiry partly by thinking about my own reactions to Bard. I've been teaching and writing history for a long time now, and I've almost never done anything else biographical. I'm known for work about big, somewhat impersonal structures and trends, economic development, environmental change, class conflict, the rise and fall of empires, religious movements. So why did this guy make me want to focus on an individual? I first came across Bard through his wartime service on Mount Davis, when I was researching the history of our site to create the Heritage Center here. And then I began noticing him in other contexts. He interested me both as an example of the millions of people who were forced to relocate and remake themselves across the violent 20th century, especially its middle decades, and as somebody who, once he was settled in a new city, left a mark across a whole bunch of spheres. Testimony to the fact that though Hong Kong was in many ways very hierarchical, with vast numbers of people having no real power, it also offered some people scope for tremendous creativity. The heavy dependence on non-governmental organizations for everything from social welfare to high culture meant that volunteerism could open doors in many sectors, even for people without the formal credentials that might have been required in a more bureaucratized society, right? In other places, you wouldn't have become the head of AMO without an archaeology degree. That was especially pronounced during a particular era of Hong Kong's history, from roughly the end of World War II until the post-Mao reopening of the mainland and then the signing of the Basic Agreement in the 80s. And this was a period of perhaps maximum political uncertainty, but also one of dramatic growth, in which economy, society, and cultural institutions here were transformed in lasting ways. And as I said before, I think it was comparable in some ways to the kinds of developments that other parts of the world experienced at roughly the same time as part of the lead up to decolonization. The refugee story is, of course, an enormous one in the early and middle 20th century, and part of what drew me as a child of refugees myself. Between roughly 1890 and 1925, the Russian, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and German empires imploded from their conflicts with each other and with nationalisms within their borders, sending people fleeing in every direction. And then near the end of that period, three of the most popular destinations for migrants, the United States, Canada, and Australia, began sharply restricting immigration. This greatly increased the importance of somewhat less popular destinations and of repeat migrations, since various places that had become first-round havens from political and social chaos, including Manchuria and Shanghai, for instance, themselves turned out to be fragile as another, even bloodier conflict emerged over the spoils of that first implosion. In 1924, when the Bards moved to China, there were an estimated 300,000 Russians there, about half in Manchuria, most of the rest in either Shanghai or Xinjiang. Many of them wound up in Hong Kong later, at least temporarily. I'm not sure how many, but enough that Hong Kong's first Orthodox church is built in 1934, and enough that there were a continuous string of relief concerts for Russians fleeing China in 1937-38. Bard played at least one of those benefit concerts, which I believe is the second time he appeared in the local press. Note how Bard's family went from Chita to Harbin and then divided itself among multiple destinations, from Buenos Aires to Shanghai when the Japanese took Manchuria. The instability of the situation is also highlighted by his parents' complex move to Argentina and back, and by the tragic fact, mentioned briefly by Bard in his recollections, that several of his Russian classmates from Harbin actually thought that their best choice was to go back to the Soviet Union, only to all die in Stalin's purges. Now, there are obviously many great human stories here, often of remarkable adaptability and persistence, right? Bard going to med school in Hong Kong when just a couple of years earlier he had basically no English. His father going into business in Buenos Aires without knowing Spanish, and the seemingly endless changes of profession that you encounter as you track these people, as people had to look for niches in their new homes. Bard's uncle David is a kind of interesting example here. He was actually in an apprenticeship program that was interrupted by the Russian Revolution. So when he fled Russia and wound up in Beirut, of all places, violin playing, which had originally been a hobby, was his most marketable skill. And he then wound up making his living playing the violin for the next 30 years in Beirut, Aleppo, Harbin, and Shanghai. Fled again from Shanghai when the communists took it in 48-49, wound up for a while joining his brother's optician business in Tel Aviv, and then stuck with that through a final move to Melbourne. Because these stories are stories of individuals making dramatic, often risky choices in dangerous times, they're the stories that probably stick with us the most. But at the risk of being a dry academic historian, I also want to zoom out and consider some big impersonal trends that we can see here. As I mentioned a minute ago, the period from 1880 to 1925 saw enormous numbers of people turned into refugees by war, nationalism, and revolution. These were very different migrations from the more economically driven ones that had sent tens of millions of Europeans to the Americas and Australia during the 19th century, and tens of millions of Indians and Chinese to Southeast Asia, mostly temporarily during the same period. The last few years of that 1890 to 1925 era, again, as I mentioned before, also saw the US, Canada, and Australia largely closed their doors. Moreover, many of these early 20th century refugees, unlike the 19th century economic migrants, were legally stateless. That further restricted their options, often to places that were somewhat politically fragile and/or militarily vulnerable themselves. Thus, places like Hong Kong and Shanghai's international settlement, which had limited capacity to absorb immigrants, but which were relatively easy to enter and reasonably stable until attacked from outside, became magnets for people from beyond the immediate region, along with the many migrants they already attracted from nearby areas. For those like the Bards who were Jewish, Palestine/Israel eventually became another such option, even if you were stateless. For many, both permanent residents and recently arrived refugees, the war years were a grim struggle to survive. Indeed, being a refugee could occasionally even be an advantage in those difficult times. Bard's wife, Sophie, also of Russian origin, was still officially stateless when the Japanese took Hong Kong in 1941, and so was not interned as an enemy alien, as she would have been had she been British, or for that matter, if she'd still had Soviet citizenship. And that was probably a blessing for her, given the conditions in the that the internees suffered. It was certainly a blessing for her POW husband, since she was able to send him some care packages. It's worth remembering here that though the battle for Hong Kong was brief, it was bloody, and many people had reasons to feel abandoned. British leaders had known that Hong Kong's defenders had no chance to prevail, but chose to fight in order to show the nationalist Chinese and the US that they were a staunch ally. Some of them also led Hong Kongers to believe that a nationalist relief force was on the way to help them, which wasn't true. And the occupation itself was awful. Hong Kong's population dropped by roughly 50%, and by August 1945, an estimated 80% of Hong Kong residents were malnourished. Shanghai, ironically, was much better fed during its occupation. This very widespread wartime suffering gave birth, I think, to an equally widespread feeling in post-war Hong Kong that simply restoring the pre-war status quo was unacceptable, that an experience that difficult had to somehow be redeemed, and that required making society better than it had been before December 1941. That kind of feeling was, of course, widely present in the many colonized places that were drawn deeply into World War II. Over 5 million people from the British Empire joined military units, and millions more either provided support services and/or suffered through occupations. And that wasn't just a British Empire thing. Many French African colonials were mobilized. Occupied Vietnam and Java had major war-related famines. And the US colony in the Philippines actually suffered far more deaths in the war than the United States itself, something that I think almost zero Americans know. In many of those places, such feelings fed above all into demands for nationhood, independence, whatever you want to call it, which intensified political jockeying and thus recriminations under over behavior under occupation. But those kinds of sentiments needed a different outlet in Hong Kong, where independence didn't seem like a realistic destination, either to most Chinese or to most non-Chinese, and where large numbers of both pre-war and post-war arrivals had no desire to join a China they had just fled. At the same time, the government was coping with a quadrupling of population just from 1945 to 55, the consequent inadequacy of basic services, and new security issues, it needed all the help it could get. Waves of activism ensued across the political spectrum, sometimes complementary and sometimes in competition, as with, for instance, unions, churches, and other groups all scrambling to create schools for a soaring number of children, and all hoping that the schools would have a particular ideological coloration. Meanwhile, early plans for significant political reform, supported by the returning governor Mark Young, were largely shelved once he was replaced by the much more conservative Alexander Grantham in 1947, and especially once the CCP triumphed on the mainland. What did get reformed, and you could even say kind of partially decolonized, was social segregation. Ordinances that had banned Chinese residents on Victoria Peak were repealed. The Hong Kong Club opened its doors to Chinese, and so on. The city also acquired a new business elite, largely of ex-Shanghai people, that wasn't locked into the old political patterns and was buttressed by foreign investment from firms that either couldn't or didn't want to operate on the mainland after the UN-led boycott of the PRC that followed its 1950 intervention in the Korean War. And unlike those who had fled to Hong Kong during earlier crises on the mainland, such as the Taiping Rebellion or the 1911 Revolution, it quickly became clear to most of these people that they wouldn't be going home for a long time, if ever. While some eventually went on to the US, UK, Canada, Taiwan, etc., most made Hong Kong a long-term home. And in this, they resembled the smaller but still significant waves of refugees like the Bards, who had originated outside of China. The onset of the Cold War increased Hong Kong's political, economic, and social separation from the mainland. But it also nurtured a sense of Hong Kong as a place where Chinese culture could and should be protected from the political currents then washing over it, both on the mainland and in Taiwan. Hong Kong was, to repeat, unusual in the post-war world, in that there was almost nobody who saw it as a future nation state. Thus, the question of what kind of change was needed to produce a sense of renewal without promising movement towards independence was crucial. This dilemma was most obvious in the stalling of political reform that I mentioned before on the one hand, and in the desegregation I mentioned on the other. But it also manifested itself in efforts to nurture a stronger Hong Kong cultural identity, efforts to which Bard mightily contributed. Post-war educational reform in Hong Kong, for instance, aimed to promote Chineseness while avoiding the nationalist element of the modern Chinese identity that had emerged on the mainland and was being transplanted, with some differences, to Taiwan. To see the significance of what was done in post-war Hong Kong, I think it's worth first backing up a bit to the late 1920s and an earlier Hong Kong government's reaction to an earlier radical political upheaval on the mainland. At that point, anti-imperialist nationalism was surging, often allied to cultural radicalism. The May 4th movement, the May 30th movement, the Hong Kong-Guangzhou Seamen's strike, the Northern Expedition of 1926 to 28, and the triumph of the Nationalist Party, initially in alliance with the Communists, all of which opposed British sovereignty over Hong Kong. The then governor of Hong Kong, a man named Cecil Clemente, was staunchly opposed to Chinese nationalism. He had, in fact, unsuccessfully urged London to aid the northern warlords against the nationalists. And he was also strongly opposed to cultural modernism. He had studied Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit at Oxford, and that was sort of his orientation. He was, on the other hand, quite attracted to more traditional forms of Chinese culture, having also studied classical Chinese and actually written a book about traditional Cantonese love songs. And he was very sympathetic to a group of conservative, mostly Neo-Confucian Chinese scholars who had left various mainland institutions and moved to Hong Kong in the wake of May 4th. He pushed for the creation of a Chinese program at HKU, which was at the time the colony's only full-fledged university, and he promoted the growth of traditional Confucian private academies with curricula that were often not too different, at least for people at the younger ages, from the private academies where many candidates for the old Qing civil service exams had begun their education. His opposition to both political nationalism and to the kind of modernism and cultural hybridization represented by the Chinese orchestras, Chinese spoken word drama, vernacular fiction, and other early 20th century innovations that I mentioned before. So this opposition to those things which claimed a place for China in the modern world by asserting that it checked all the same cultural boxes as other nations, right? National canons of classical music, opera, literature, etc. The influence of Clemente's efforts was limited, not only by the colonial government's small budget, but by the ways in which Hong Kong education at that time was inextricably bound up with education on the mainland. Students often went to high school on one side of the border and college on the other, especially since Hong Kong had few colleges, and many Hong Kong elites wanted their children to prepare for careers in business or other activities that would involve operating in China. This meant that at least high school curricula in those days couldn't be too wildly incompatible. Given the relative numbers of students in Hong Kong and on the mainland, this inevitably meant that even many fairly conservative Hong Kong high schools used textbooks in those days that were written for the mainland market, which after 1927 meant textbooks that had been approved by the nationalists' education ministry. So despite the very anti-nationalist bent of the Hong Kong government and of this governor Clemente, the education system had to facilitate movement back and forth between the two places. With the help of that detour back to the 1920s, I think we can see more clearly what was new about the cultural identity promoted in the post-war Renaissance. A 1953 report from the government's Committee on Chinese Studies is instructive here. It called for Hong Kong to implement a Chinese language education program, which emphasized cultivating the ability to express oneself in written and spoken Chinese, and awareness of Chinese traditions, but also said explicitly that this should aim to create people who, quote, contribute something towards the interpretation of China to the West and the West to China. And the report also went on to say that these people should be guided to utilize their Chinese education, quote, as a basis for making comparative studies of Eastern and Western thought and language. So this goal represented a Chinese identity for Hong Kong that included a simultaneous claim on both Chinese and Western cultures. And that, of course, was something that made sense for Hong Kong. But it also notably, it implied some degree of permanent distinction from both Britain and China. That separation was, of course, reinforced by Cold War restrictions on cross-war border movement. And in education and cultural specifically, both by the increasingly communist content of mainland education, a non-starter for many in Hong Kong, and by the mainland's adoption of simplified characters, reducing mutual legibility in the most literal sense. in nurturing a cultural agenda that was clearly Chinese, but distinct from that in any Chinese-governed state, and also deeply engaged with Western high culture, this program of education shared quite a bit with the private cultural initiatives going on in organizations like the Sino-British Club, with the founding of New Asia College, Chengji College, and United College, three ideologically distinct schools that would later merge to form CUHK, with the founding of the Hong Kong Academy of Fine Arts in 1952 by Choi Hai-ying, a Hong Kong school painter who was nonetheless powerfully influenced. Oops, how do we click on this thing? There we go. As you can see here, by Western painters like John Singer Sargent, and with the government-assisted formation, later on, of the HKCO, the Hong Kong Performing Arts Academy, and so on. These efforts converged, I think, on the formation of a hybrid and largely non-nationalist culture for a city that was envisioned as staying on the edge of both British and Chinese spheres, rather than being destined, like most colonies, to eventually become an independent political sphere of its own. This emphasis on hybridity, rather than either a colonial British or a politically Chinese identity, left space for non-Chinese, non-Anglos, like Solomon Bard, and they played major roles in this cultural renaissance, something that's hardly unique to this period, but I think is also sometimes forgotten and was sometimes particularly strong in this period. Arrigo Foa, Bard's friend who conducted the Hong Kong Philharmonic from 53 to 69 in music, Alfonso Barreto and George Smirnoff in art, and so on. Some of these people mostly transferred to the Hong Kong setting the artistic traditions they had absorbed in Europe or other European colonies. Others, to varying degrees, were also influenced by Chinese culture. Bard, I think, was unusual in the degree to which he both transplanted non-Chinese, non-Anglo traditions to Hong Kong and fully embraced the post-war effort to develop a distinctively Chinese culture in the city. Think particularly of the HKCO and of his emphasis on Chinese over Western sites in designating and protecting monuments. And that, I think, makes this particular refugee truly a Hong Kong Renaissance man, or a man of the Hong Kong Renaissance. I'll stop there, and we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Questions? Is anybody feeding me questions from online? We usually take those as well, if there are no questions in the room. Anything? Anybody? Nothing online either. Okay. Thank you. Li Wei.
Thank you for the presentation. Can you talk a little bit about the exhibition, the planning process? Where did you find the artifacts, and was it easy to acquire them?
Okay. Well, most of the artifacts we have actually come from the Bard family, so thank you very much. There are a couple of other recreated artifacts. As I mentioned, we duplicated the cello made out of an oil drum that was in the POW camp. We also have a duplicate of Bard's graduation gown, a couple of other things like that. The idea for the exhibition as I said before, it really dates back to when I was doing the research for the permanent collection here and was looking at what happened in December 41 and came across this guy who, kind of sounded interesting. And then his names just started popping up in a bunch of places. And I thought, here's somebody who I think has a lot to tell us. And then sort of one thing led to another, right? I started finding people who had known him in these various different parts of life and who would then refer me to other people. So it was really kind of, human chain sort of research. And just the more that I thought about him, the more I became convinced that it was not only, just a really interesting individual story, but something that told us about Hong Kong. And again, I think tells us maybe particularly about the importance of thinking in Hong Kong beyond an Anglo-Chinese binary. I mean, Bard did become a British citizen, but in many ways, obviously, he's shaped by a completely different background. I mean, the last thing I guess I would say is, so as I mentioned, I have not in my career done much biographical kind of work. And so as I started to do this and realized that I was venturing into a field I didn't really understand in some ways, I was at a conference and I ran into a friend, a guy named Tim Brooke, who does do very biographical studies of various famous Chinese figures. And I said, so, as I think about this guy, I keep asking, what would Tim Brooke do? And Tim listened to Bard's story for a minute and said, forget me, ask what Spielberg would do with this guy. I mean, he's just a kind of larger than life figure and couldn't resist him.
Thank you, Professor Pomeranz, for a wonderful presentation and lecture on Solomon Bard's life. So your lecture actually reminds me of a documentary I recently watched. It's about Harry Odell. I'm not sure if you have heard of him.
I have heard of him. I have not seen the documentary.
Yeah, so I think Harry Odell is also a Russian Jew, and he also has a really legendary life, like first go to Shanghai and then come to Hong Kong. So I saw a lot of resemblances here, and I kind of really inspired me about your argument about there is a non-Anglo, non-Chinese spear in Hong Kong.
Yeah, no, I think that those people are good examples. The Portuguese who come from Macau, in many cases, are good examples. Foa, who gets his musical education in is Portuguese background, but gets his musical education in Italy, in Milan, and then winds up here as another one. They're just,
Yes.
And then still other older groups. I mean, think of all the Armenians, from Paul Chater on, who have played crucial roles in making this city. It's something about this place that A, was relatively open and easy to get into, and B, was on the, was at the intersection of these two great empires, right? And clearly fed off being the membrane through which these things moved. And then again, I think also, the sort of bitter fact that in the middle of the 20th century, places like Hong Kong were, ironically, enriched by the fact that there were all these people fleeing other places who often couldn't get to more distant and safer destinations like Australia or the United States. And so they wind up in third places, at least for a time.
Yes.
I knew Solomon Bard mainly through the Hong Kong Regiment. And one thing I recall him talking to him, one of the most humiliating experiences he ever had was being marched in December 1941 as a prisoner of war being marched through the streets of Kowloon, not knowing where they're going, and they're going backwards and forwards. And the Chinese population were looking at these so-called, or mainly British soldiers on their way to, in fact, turned out to be Shamshipo camp. He said that's the most humiliating experience he ever had in his life.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, obviously there's the personal fear and terror of, who knows what they're going to do with you, who knows how long it's going to last, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's also, if we step away from the personal for a moment, we remember that one of the things World War II did in large chunks of Asia was it shattered the myth that the British, the French, the Americans, the Dutch, whoever, that they were invincible, right? And if they were going to come back to particular places after the war, they were going to have to come back on different terms, because a certain kind of really extreme racial hierarchy just wasn't going to fly once people had seen that, yeah, you could be defeated. And in fact, you could be defeated by Asians. It's a big part of the story of decolonization in Asia. And then, of course, in Hong Kong, as I said, it doesn't become decolonization in the political sense. But I think it is part of the background to why things like restricting Victoria Peak to only non-Chinese just wasn't viable anymore, right? And why it was important to sort of create a new identity for this place, whether socially or culturally or however, even though you weren't going to do it politically.
Time, one more question.
It seems that somebody like Solomon Baird had an immense effect on Hong Kong in many different areas. So I just wondered if, when you're looking at this, if you came to any kind of opinion yourself as to what led to that. I mean, some things you could possibly say. Was it because he was extremely intelligent? Was it because he was an outsider? Was it because he was very driven? Was it because he was great at liaising with people? Or what do you think it was?
I mean, I think all those things were true.
Right.
And he clearly, among other things, simply had very, very impressive people skills, right? I mean, think about what it would be to be the only non-Chinese in the Hong Kong Chinese Orchestra, to be not actually all that well trained in Chinese music, often unable to communicate with the musicians, right? Because many of them spoke only Chinese, and only Mandarin for that matter. And yet to be able to assert yourself successfully and get a very fractious group of people to agree to work together. I mean, those are really unusual skills. That said, I think apart from the force of his personality, I think there also was something about the cultural moment, both because of the post-World War II thing and because Hong Kong was not a very bureaucratized society, right? So much was always done through the private nonprofit sector, right? That the fact that you didn't have a formal credential in a particular area wasn't necessarily crucial if you were willing to take some personal risks, right? Because of course, if you haven't studied X very much and you take on an important role in field X, you are risking making a fool of yourself, right? And Bard clearly was somebody who both had the skills and confidence to know he wasn't likely to make a fool of himself, but also had the kind of character where he kind of said, I do what I can, and if once in a while I fall on my face, it's not the end of the world. And a society that isn't insisting on formal credentials for everything, because it doesn't have mile-long sets of bureaucratic regulations, is a society in which somebody like that can have tremendous impact across a whole bunch of areas. I can
And I
go
think
on, but
if I'm reading
yeah.
the signal across the room,
Yeah.
our guest would like to answer the question.
No, actually, I didn't want to answer a question, but what I wanted to do was to thank you because, Ken, you've done a wonderful service to Solly. There are a number of people in the room this evening who knew him and liked him and admired him in a number of respects, myself included. And seeing this is very, very moving because he was such a special man. And the work that you've done in bringing this forward is fabulous. And you deserve everyone's thanks. And I would like to make that point. Right.
thank you. For those of us who don't know, that was Jason Wordie, who was interviewed by us for the exhibit. There's a recording of the interview, a short one that you can see in the exhibit, a longer one that's online. And Jason is one of a number of people without whom this exhibit would not have come together. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to sign out with our online audience. And for those of you that are in the classroom here, we're going to shuttle you over to the exhibition while we prepare for the next part of the evening event. But before we do so, I have housekeeping, which is to remind all of you, if you don't already know, that we have a podcast that we produce on this campus called The Course. And it's a podcast that features our faculty from UChicago and talks a bit about their research, but really talks about how they became professors. So I encourage you to listen to the Course podcast. Professor Pomeranz is, I believe it's episode 1. So you can hear his story about how he became a professor, which is really fascinating. It's one of my favorites. And then the next thing I just wanted to mention is we do have another talk here on Monday night called Where is China Going? And Professor Xie, he's in the Booth School, but he's the faculty director for the Becker-Friedman Institute. It's part of our China on the Move series. He's going to talk about China and what China's doing with business failures now. And so that'll be a really interesting program. It came to us just a few days ago, so the team has been scrambling to put that one together. And then finally, as I mentioned, for those of you that are on the online audience, I hope if you haven't seen the exhibition that you have a chance to see that. And thank you to the Bards and to Professor Pomeranz and to everybody else who participated in helping make this exhibition a success. And we're going to now say goodbye to the online audience. And for those of you who are in the room, you can follow our staff, I believe, by going to the lobby where you came in, walk across the courtyard and go into the exhibition and have a look around. But we're also going to ask you to be back by 6:30, in your seats by 6:30 so that we can start the concert part of the performance on time. Thank you so much. Thank you.